This gay issue for me, as I know and as I read, did not start just last year or last 2 years. And the church have struggled with it. Several general conventions that this issue has been picked up. And people need to know that it's part of the history, it's part of their story.
There are people for whom it is utterly inconceivable that a gay man could be a bishop. That's simple. That goes back to all sorts of different cultural presuppositions about sex. It goes back to different ways of reading the Bible. It goes back to the way in which the British Empire carved up the world in the name of different theological positions. It's actually multi-layered. I actually like to think of it as a very simple issue. The simple issue is, are we standing beside our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters who are often some of the most vulnerable people in the communion, particularly, I think, if you're gay and lesbian and you live in a culture that's deeply homophobic.
Should a person in a relationship be in a position of authority? And be open about it, I would add, because I think no one seriously believes that the church has not had gay and lesbian persons in leadership down through the centuries. The issue has been, are they open about their lives and their loves, their partnerships? And it's a challenge for many parts of the world who want to look at the issue divisively, that you're either on one side or the other, that there isn't a range of toleration, fellowship in spite of disagreement, and at the far extreme, exclusion, and a rules-based model for deciding who's in and who's out. Anglicanism has had the genius of being able to include diverse opinions on many matters that some would say are far more important. The very nature of the Eucharist, for instance, was hotly debated in the time of the Elizabethan settlement, and yet the final settlement was to say, we won't argue about it anymore. We'll allow both of the views to simply coexist and accept that fact. I would argue that the sexuality issue is far less significant to the church than the issue of the nature of the Eucharist. And I have my own opinions about the nature of the Eucharist. But I also understand that others have differing opinions, and yet we're able to coexist and in fact share that Eucharist, to gather at that table and celebrate that together, even if we're carrying in our minds very different notions of what's going on. We're there together.
I think many of us in the church have been raised to not talk about sex and sexuality, period. I think it's cultural, it's culturally part of Protestant Christianity. It's very Western, it's all in all kinds of ways that is reinforced by the world around us. I think it's not surprising that there are people opposed to full inclusion in the church, and that even find it confusing to find gay and lesbian people sitting in the pews next to them or in the leadership of the church. So I don't, it makes sense to me that there would be opposition. But I think one of the challenges of church is remembering what the point of church is. I come from a family that's extremely religious. Most of my family would probably find it quite scandalous, and do find it scandalous to talk about Bishop Robinson and what's happened in New Hampshire. They don't have any personal issues with him. They would be more likely to say they'd rather just not talk about things like that. I think the reality of our world is you don't have an option not to talk about things like that. And the truth of the gospel is that Jesus consistently tells us to put ourselves on the side of those that are most disenfranchised. So this is the gospel message, and here's the community that is disenfranchised and that is ostracized. And the biblical arguments around what marriage should be and what family should be, the traditional Christian arguments, I shouldn't say biblical arguments, biblical scholarship and sociology and all kinds of other disciplines show us that those aren't necessarily biblical teachings as much as they are kind of cultural teachings and things that we have just become used to. So if we are to be faithful to the gospel in this time, we have to push forward in a way that I think makes many people uncomfortable. I think we're wrong to not assume they will be uncomfortable, but that doesn't make it any less true or any less our mission as church.
It's a blip, if you will, on the scale of world problems that need attention. And it speaks more to our preoccupation and fear of sexuality, preoccupation with and fear of sexuality, than it does to the mission of the church. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a distraction. With the one exception, it's a necessary evil. Homophobia is a necessary evil to address because it diminishes persons, and it diminishes families, and it diminishes congregations, and it can indeed diminish the resources of churches and the witness in churches.
Very often I have experienced people asking for theological rationale. Why are we doing this? What is the reason? And I've said to people many times, there are libraries of books written on the issue of homosexuality and the scriptures and our theological tradition in understanding the complexity of human sexuality in a more inclusive way. The difficulty is not that we don't have the theological resources, but that people are not reading them. And I think one of our big challenges is to put Anglicans throughout the world in contact with the resources that already exist so that they can begin to see these few texts in Scripture, and they really are very few in number, which appear to condemn same-sex relationships. We can begin to put those texts in context, the context of the larger witness of Scripture, which is towards God's radically inclusive and unconditional love.
The greatest challenge may be that folks have not understood, have not seen the grace of God in the ministries of gays and lesbians, or the grace of God in committed same-sex relationships. For a lot of folks, I think that reality exists only in theory or on paper or as an argument, and folks have not been able to live in community with gays and lesbians and with gay and lesbian couples, and been able to really sense how God has blessed those folks already and how those folks have often been a blessing in their communities.
Homophobia is a sin, and its end time is now. Homophobia is a sin because I wanted to say that it was not simply psycho-spiritual homophobia, but the institutionalization of homophobia, that's a sin, and its end time is now, in the sense that it's time for us to uproot from our church, as well as from our society, those institutional policies that oppress LGBT persons. So it's a systemic evil that is generated by our limited imagination and conceiving of ways to relate to each other in wholesome ways sexually. And the systemic evil is that LGBT lifestyles have been cast into outer darkness by taboos against them. And it's time to end that, because taboos are cruel and they are based on a gospel lie. And so basically it's time to reform our institutions so that our institutional policies reflect open access and respect for LGBT persons.
Hate is a pretty complicated human emotion. And when people hate me because of how God created me, that feels like the rearing up of evil, especially when they don't know me. Especially when they don't understand the commitments I've made, the way I live my life, the manner of my life, and just simply judge me. For me, homophobia is like racism or anti-Semitism. It's a manifestation of sin, it's a manifestation of fear, it's a manifestation of ignorance, and sometimes it's a manifestation of hate and of evil.